my name's Isaiah. I'm going to be doing a quick presentation for you on the subject of classical conditioning. It's something that's very relevant in psychology and something you'll probably see in almost any introductory psychology course. So I want to start us off with a quick kind of discussion or internal thought process that I want you to think about really quick. So take a few seconds, look back at the last time you had to train a pet, right? So for me, I'm a big dog person. I love dogs. I got one a couple years ago, so this information is very relevant to me. What did you do successfully to train that dog, right? Did you scold it when it did something poorly? Did you reward it when it did something agreeable? Did you give it a treat? Did you give it a toy? Did you send it to the kennel? Kind of what did you do to successfully train that dog? What we're going to learn about today is why we do those things. So it's a very relevant topic I want you to kind of think about as we go through the next couple slides. But before that, I want to talk about learning. What is learning? To me and you, it might be a traditional sense, a setting such as a classroom with maybe a professor at the front of the room teaching a class, going over something while the students have their textbooks cracked open, they have their laptops typing notes or writing notes or otherwise. But in psychology, we believe that learning is a long-term change in behavior that's based primarily on experience. And so the two main types of learning in psychology are called classical conditioning and operant conditioning. What we're going to be going over, like I previously stated, is classical conditioning. But before we do that, I want to quickly introduce you to a man named Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who actually studied digestion. He's best known for his experiment with dogs, and we'll learn more about his famous experiment here shortly. But he also won Russia's first Nobel Prize in 1904, which is just a few years after he published this experiment and the research he got from the experiment. Real quick, just in case you haven't heard of it, I want to give you a quick synopsis on his experiment he did with dogs. So to kind of break it down for you, what he did was he observed dogs, but primarily in this experiment, he observed them eating. So every time the dog would eat, or see food rather, he would salivate. And so he started to pair the food with a bell. So every time he would give the dog food, he would ring a bell. Eventually, and it would salivate. Eventually, he removed the food, and the dogs continued to salivate, even without the food, just the ring of the bell. So that's kind of a quick synopsis on classical conditioning. He conditioned the dogs to think the bell meant food, therefore salivating to the bell. Okay, so I'm going to break down some terminology for you that's going to help this make a little bit more sense when we connect the terminology with the experiment. So bear with me here. We'll start out with classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is the type of learning in which one learns to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. So we'll learn more about that in the actual experiment. Neutral stimulus, that's a stimulus which initially produces no specific response, which in our case is the bell, right? So at first the bell means nothing to the dog has no response to the bell. It's just a bell, it's neutral stimulus. Conditioned response is a learned response to a previously neutral but now learned stimulus. So conditioned response would be the salivating to the bell without the food, right? So I have now conditioned this dog to respond positively to the sound of the bell, relating it to the food. So again, we'll get more into that. And then three more here. We got conditioned stimulus, which is a previously neutral stimulus that after becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually comes to trigger a conditioned response. So in this case, this would be the bell after conditioning. So before conditioning, the bell was neutral. But now that we've related the bell with the food, it's now a conditioned stimulus because the dog salivates at the sound of the bell. An unconditioned response, this one's super easy. So it's an unlearned response that occurs naturally in reaction to the unconditioned stimulus. So an unconditioned response would be the dog initially, before conditioning, salivating to the food. It's something that's unlearned. It's something that they naturally occur, right? They see food and they salivate. They like food, right? So it's an unconditioned response, unlearned. Whereas an unconditioned stimulus is a natural stimulus that leads to an automatic or unconditioned response. So that would be the actual food itself. The dog has an unconditioned response to the unconditioned stimulus. And we'll actually see that right here as I connect all of this. So first up, before conditioning, like I said, in the very left-hand corner, we have the food or the state, as I have pictured here, which is originally the unconditioned stimulus creating an unconditioned response. The dog salivating, drooling at the food. And then on the right side, we have the neutral stimulus, which is the bell sound. I have it as a whistle here, but same difference. Presents no response from the dog. And then as we go through the conditioning that Pavlov did, he added the bell sound with the food. So previously neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. After conditioning, we remove the food, and now that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, creating a conditioned response. So you can kind of see the trajectory here. Dog sees food, it salivates. Now it hears the bell, it salivates because it related the two, and that kind of ties together our modern day training of dogs. Like I said earlier, would you give that dog a treat every time it did something well? You typically see that response reciprocated and continued, right? The dog's going to sit now every time you say sit because it knows it's going to get a treat or a pet or a toy or otherwise. Another example of classical conditioning, kind of unrelated to dogs, right? In our own personal lives, something interesting like a vibration, right? A vibration is a pretty neutral stimulus beforehand, but now that it's so closely related to our phones, every time we feel or think we feel a vibration in our pocket, we're going to reach for that phone. Because we've conditioned ourselves to every time we look at that phone when it vibrates, it's a text from a loved one or an emergency call or otherwise, right? We want to pick up that phone and look at it. So we've classically conditioned ourselves to respond to that vibration or that ringtone or otherwise. And then another real world example I like to kind of go over is, say the fear of dogs, something that you may have experienced or someone you may know has experienced. So say you're a child, right? You're walking down the same route you do every day to go to school. As you pass a particular house, a dog comes running up to the fence, it starts barking, showing its teeth, getting really scary. It may even jump over the fence and, bite your leg or something like that. Something that's very frightening and traumatic, especially, nonetheless to any person, but rather a small child, right? Prior to this traumatic experience, you thought dogs were pretty neutral, right? Maybe you didn't own a dog, but you seen them in a pretty friendly light. They didn't do anything positive or negative for you. They were just dogs. Well, years later, you may experience a case of spontaneous recovery, right? You may not necessarily remember back when you were 5 and that dog had scared you, but you're passing down a similar street with a house, and the fence says beware of dog, and the dog comes up and barks at you, or even just the sight of the dog causes you to have an increased heart rate. You might start walking a little faster. You might get a little scared of this dog, right? That's a classical condition because you took what was previously a neutral stimulus, and now you're conditioned to be scared of it, even if you don't remember. So it's really interesting to see kind of a real-world example of that and something you might have actually experienced yourself. The interesting thing about classical conditioning is it can actually be undone. So if we go back to our previous slide here, so we know that the bell sound is now created a conditioned response because it's a conditioned stimulus. Well, if we continue to ring this bell and not give this dog any food, it's eventually going to be undone because the dog will no longer correlate the bell with the food. It's no longer getting any food, so it's going to stop salivating. This may take a lot longer because who knows how long the dog was actually conditioned to believe that two are, correlated, but it is something that can be undone, and that was something that I found to be kind of interesting that we've learned since. But that's pretty much all I've got on the topic of classical conditioning. I really appreciate you guys sticking around. I hope you learned something about classical conditioning and psychology. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.